Greetings, Earthers, Martians, Belters, members of the OPA. Welcome to episode 14 of Expanse, the Unofficial podcast. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. I have a very special episode for you today. I have another behind-the-scenes interview today with Jeremy Benning, the director of photography on The Expanse. So Jeremy is definitely the star of this show, so I'm going to just get right on to the interview. Jeremy Benning is joining me on the show today, and Jeremy is the director of photography for The Expanse. Welcome to the show, Jeremy.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining me tonight and speaking with me and the listeners. I really appreciate it. I guess my first question would be, could you explain exactly what your job as director of photography, like what that entails and what's involved with that?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a few different ways to describe what I do. I mean, it's also referred to as the cinematographer.
Okay.
Director of photography is sort of one and the same. They both sort of mean the same thing. But essentially, my role is to work with the director. And, you know, in the case of a television show, when you've got, you know, showrunners and writers and executive producers, it becomes sort of a larger creative team because the director obviously is one part of a big machine because different directors will be doing different episodes. So you're kind of working with the whole team as like a big picture to come up with what the overall visual look of the show is. Because my responsibility is the photography, obviously. So that entails the lighting design, the types of cameras that we're using, the types of lenses that we're going to use, the way we're going to move the camera, you know, the entire technical crew as far as the lighting department and camera department and the grip department, which are the team that's involved with rigging and that kind of thing. That's basically the people that I work with, and I kind of run those departments.
Okay.
So it's kind of like where the art meets the science, I guess you could call it.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also working with the production designer and of course with the VFX team, which you guys have spoken to already. You know, we all work together, you know, and my job is to make sure that what I'm doing and what we're doing together all is kind of in sync. So visually everything works together, that the visual effects work with the live photography of the actors and the sets, and anytime there's set extensions, that what we're doing, you know, works together, that everything's seamless, and also that the tone of the show is appropriate to the story and the direction of the story. 'Cause, you know, as it arcs throughout the whole season, you know, the show kind of evolves as it goes, and that's part of making sure that the look evolves with the story as well. So that's sort of my area of expertise.
Well, that's really cool. So I guess maybe then you would be responsible for, I guess, what I would call the kind of gritty look to the show compared to some of the other science fiction we've seen on TV in the past.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think that's a combination of both of what I do and also with what Seth Reed, the production designer, was doing. Because, you know, it was a team effort to figure out, okay, what should the look of the sets be? How are they going to be treated in terms of, you know, paint and texture and materials? And then how are those going to interact with light? And, you know, how dark should things be? And texture, and, you know, obviously one of the big things with the show from the beginning was talking about how it's meant to be as real as we can imagine this time in the future would be. I mean, we spent a lot of time really trying to imagine, you know, what would the realities be of this environment, you know, in the future, in terms of the working class nature of it. How do people live? What do they eat? You know, what do they do for fun? You know, how are environments decorated? How are they lit? You know, what kind of, all those things that are kind of, you know, become ubiquitous in our daily lives that we don't even think about. Suddenly, when you're thinking in the future, everything has to be made, because obviously nothing's off the shelf. We're trying to sell the idea of the world that the books have done such a great job of creating with their scientific background, that, you know, now we're trying to take that into a visual world where an audience is actually going to see it. And you know, people have to believe what they're seeing, because we're trying to sell it as being a real interpretation of what the future might hold. So that means trying to visualize that from a, you know, whatever that reality is. So you speak about the grittiness of it, and, you know, we sort of always imagine it as like, this is a working class place, and you've basically got like the cheap labor, so to speak, of today's world has been exported into the solar system, and they're out there working as if you were working on an oil rig, or in some kind of like remote outpost mining kind of thing. And it's the same mentality, but with all the kind of advances of future technology. But essentially, it's the same kind of lifestyle. So that, I think, that was the influence to kind of make things gritty, and it wouldn't be a clean, slick place in the sense of other ways we've seen the future depicted. So I think that was sort of the initial discussions that we had right from the beginning, and we sort of took it from there.
Okay, cool. Well, it seems sort of related to what you've been saying, so I'm going to jump ahead to a question actually Nikki gave me for you.
Sure. Yeah.
She knows a little bit more about photography than I do.
Sure.
She wants to know, what was your personal goal for the visual identity for The Expanse, creatively speaking?
I think for me, like I mean, this goes back to the work that I've done in the past and what I've been known for doing in the past, and I think that's partly why the producers asked me to do this. Was I've done a lot of documentary work, and I've done projects where we're trying to recreate something that's factual, like a historical event that's well documented. And for example, I did Killing Lincoln, which was a National Geographic drama that's an extremely detailed account of the assassination of Lincoln. And in that case, it was all about trying to portray what that place and time looked like visually as much as possible. Now, it's kind of funny in a way, because The Expanse is basically polar opposite, where now it's like the future and trying to imagine a future time. And if we had a way of looking at some kind of documents of what it would look like in the future, that was sort of my goal of like, what would be the most realistic kind of like recreation of what we think this future will look like based on the science that we think might exist, and where we can see the human race going with technology and the way commerce works, and solar system exploration. So for me, my goal was really to try and make that as real as I could. At the same time, obviously giving it some style and some grit. So you could say maybe it's you're embellishing a tiny bit, but the whole time trying to keep true to the core of what is real and what could be real. So that was my goal, was to try and approach everything that we did from what would this really be like, and obviously the books they have some references to the visual style of certain things and the way certain things looked, and I wanted to make sure that we were also being faithful to the books, because a lot of people are going to come at the show having been familiar with the books, and so everyone's going to have a certain image in their head of what things look like, because the books do give you some of that detail.
Yeah.
So for me, that was my intent, was to make sure that we were faithful to the whatever visual notes that we could pick from the books. We wanted to make sure that we were true to that, and and it was great having Ty and Daniel were around a lot. And when we were shooting, Ty was he was there most of the time. Daniel was usually away dealing with other things, and I'm sure dealing with the books. So they kind of shared the duties of the show a little bit. And Ty spent a lot of time with me on set, so I had my own kind of monitor area on set where I worked from. And Ty pretty much sat with me the whole time, which was great, because I could always turn to him and say, hey, what would if there was a question that would come up, like, how would this thing happen? Or if these engines turned on and this happened, what would the effect be? If there were things that came up kind of spur of the moment as we were shooting, I could always turn to Ty and ask him a question. So, I was also trying to make sure that what I was doing was in, keeping with what he was imagining it. And, he was right there looking over my shoulder, looking at the monitor a lot of the time, and which was great, because he would chime in with kind of, input, or just, it was kind of interesting, having the guy who writes the books looking at the monitor and going like, wow, I never really quite pictured it that way, but it's really cool, because some of the things that they wrote, they hadn't necessarily put a visual, mental image to it on their own. And then now they're seeing it. Here it is in like flesh and blood, and for real on a monitor. And, it was great to kind of see that reaction of them getting excited about what we were doing. So it was kind of a nice sort of, synergy creatively that way. Cause I wanted to make sure that, that was the big kind of intimidating factor of going into something knowing that you've got this, a very loyal and strong fan base, and obviously, you want to do it justice. You want people to look at what you've done and be like, yeah, okay, that's in the vein of what I imagine is the world of the books, right? So to me, that was my goal, was to, because I'm the sort of the one between myself and the production designer. We're sort of the one through line throughout the whole show, visually speaking, when it comes to the world, because the directors, coming, there's like every 2 episodes is a different director, and Terry McDonough did the first 2 and the last 2, but in between there was, we had 4 directors overall, so someone has to keep that continuity of the visual going, which basically falls on my shoulders and the production designer and his team of set builders and stuff like that. So that was my intent, really, was to, from a personal creative standpoint, was to really try and sink my teeth into what I imagined the world to be as much as I could, and to be real as much as I didn't want people to look at something and be like, well, that looks kind of fake, or that looks lit. Like my worst fear would be people would look at what we were doing and think like, that looks really lit or fake, or so that was, I think we've achieved that. It's from, it's always hard to judge these things when you're so deep inside of it, but I think when I step back and look at it, I think we've done that.
I think you guys are nailing it, and I'm a fan of the books, and there are so many things that when I see it in the show, I either think that's exactly what I pictured, or that's way better than what I pictured.
Well, it's interesting because, when I started doing it, like I hadn't read the books before the show came about. I wasn't familiar with them. And then suddenly this opportunity came along, and, I was very aware of the books all of a sudden. And I right away, I went out and bought the first book and started reading it. And this is about, a few weeks or a month before I actually started official, prepping on the show. But once I started getting the scripts, it was like, trying to read the scripts and the book has slightly variations from the script, and vice versa. It started to get confusing to try and read both. I thought, what, I can't read the books right now. I have to just focus on the scripts and rely on the fact that we're surrounded by everybody who knows the books, especially we have the writers there. But what was great was that a lot of the other team, like our set decorator, Pete Nick, and Jim Murray, our props master, these guys had read the books, and a lot of them had they'd read all the books and were huge fans themselves. So it was great having them as a resource, because I came to it I hadn't had a chance to read the books yet, but right away fell in love with the whole idea of it. I'm like, wow, I got to read these books now. But then I've got to read the scripts too. So I relied on these guys who knew the world really well, which was great, because we'd be having discussions about things, and like the set decorator would be, he knew the books, like, 3-4 books ahead of what we were doing. So he would ask questions like, should we include, this thing about, the food or the food dispenser, or some detail that was revealed in a later book. But there were things that would appear in the first season that weren't addressed in the scripts, but if you knew the books, they would be details of things that would be kind of popping up in the background, and little subtexts and things like that the fans would obviously enjoy. And these guys, being fans of the books, wanted to try and, whatever they could, insert little things that may not be mentioned in the first book, but if you knew the books, you'd be like, oh, that's that thing from like book 2 or book 3. So it was great having those guys around to kind of always be sounding boards of like the world in general, because they knew the world so well. And and they really, everyone had a great time with that, because they were so sort of inspired by the books, that they really wanted to inject as much as they could into their whatever their department was, whether it's props or wardrobe or set decoration. So there was a lot of opportunities to pepper the sets in the world with little kind of Easter eggs for the fans. That was the fun part too.
Awesome. Well, one thing that really blew me away in the first episode is the first time when we see Ceres,
right?
And the artificial blue sky was just amazing. And I also loved the contrast between that part of the station and like the dock area, which was much, dirtier and more dimly lit, and it was great.
Well, I mean, that was an interesting thing, because obviously, color discussions came up a lot, and like what color is the light, and I had read enough of the book to get the reference to the painted blue sky and how it was kind of faded and cracked, and It had this sort of like odd, surreal kind of like Las Vegas casino effect, and I thought that was a great, like, of course, that's what humans are, people from Earth,
right?
That's what they're going to do. They're going to go to another asteroid, and create another sort of mini Earth. And that's your first notion is like, well, we got to make the sky, the ceiling look like a sky. But of course, it's funny because now people who've lived there for, 100 or more years, they've never seen a blue sky before. So to them, it's like, they don't even understand the significance of why is this ceiling painted like a sky.
Yeah.
But the fact that it actually becomes a light source. So that became a thing of like, well, all the light in this main, residential section would be bounced off this weird painted sky. So everything in that world kind of had this sort of, slightly sickly bluish kind of tinge to it. So, and that was the thing too, is that, we knew there were so many worlds that we're jumping between. And for people who may not be familiar with the books, that was always the constant worry, is like, are people going to be able to follow this? Because there's so much going on and we have to kind of get all this information into, this first season, especially the first couple episodes, that it was really important to make sure that visually there was a distinct kind of look for each place. So as soon as you would see it, you go, oh, that's the series residential sector, or that's the loading dock, that's the airlock set, that's the night. People had to know within the first few seconds of seeing the beginning of another scene where they were, because you're jumping around so much that, aside from recognizing the characters, you need to know the world as well. So the color palette became an important way of doing that, even if it's a subconscious thing that people may not be, fully aware of it. But subconsciously, the audience had to be aware of where they were, and so there were color cues like that would, which I think work, because I'm watching it back myself. I'm sort of picking up on, okay, that's now we're in this place, and because sometimes you only see a little corner of it, and you have to know that we're in that corner of the docks, or we're in the corner of the the Midtown stretch, or the Medina, for example. So yeah, that was and again, that was Seth, and he had an amazing team of people. He had like 18 or 19 artists working for him, like for weeks and weeks and weeks, and pretty much a core of them stayed out through the entire production, because there was always something new to build. There was always new sets being built, always something new, and these guys were constantly churning out. I would get like stacks of 10, 12 pages of new drawings every day, pretty much.
Wow.
Of new sets. And so it was like basically being involved with like building a city, where you're being handed, okay, here's the design for this place, and every day you'd be like, wow, okay, here's this new thing, and trying to stay one step ahead of like, okay, in 2 weeks we're going to be in this new place that none of us have seen before. We've read the script, we know the place, but we haven't been there. And to sort of like get these drawings and work with Seth and his team to figure out, okay, what should it look like, what has to happen there, and then getting the drawings. And and he had an amazing team of visual artists who were conceptual artists, as well as the actual set drafts people. But the conceptual artists were great, because they could basically take our ideas as a team, and not just the look of the world, of the actual architecture, let's call it, but also what's the texture, what's the color, what's the lighting, all those things. And we'd work together with them, and they'd basically come up with these beautiful renderings that were basically like paintings, almost like graphic novel style paintings, that were like fully representational of the color and the texture and the light. And I would really work with them to kind of try and tell them, like, this is how I'm going to light it, this is how I think the light will interplay with this set. And they would come up with these drawings that I think were pretty faithful to that idea. And that's basically what we would share with all the producers and the directors, and everyone would look at these drawings and be like, oh, okay, yeah, that's what we're picturing, or this is the right feel. And if they didn't think it was quite right, we'd go back and rework it with them. And I now have this great binder that has dozens and dozens of these drawings in it that we created over the course of the show, that when you flip through it, after now that we've finished it, it's fun. I just did it over the Christmas break. I went through the binder, and it's like, wow, it's really cool to see that all these drawings that we did are pretty much, it's like all the main kind of worlds of the show are all depicted in these drawings that we did months and months ago. So, and I think they posted a few of these. I think there's some online. There's been some posted on some of the fan pages, some of the the early drawings of the Canterbury and the the ice harvesting and stuff like that. Like, these guys are, you know, super talented, and they're also the same guys that help design the exteriors of the ships, like the you know, the Rocinante and the, you know, the Ceres station. All these exteriors, they were all designed by those guys too.
Very cool. Yeah, I've seen some of that art that you mentioned. It's really awesome stuff.
I hope they do some kind of book. I'm sure they'll do at some point, publish some kind of book, because it really is, you know. And it's interesting because as we were in pre-production, we were seeing fans were actually creating artwork of what they imagined things to be, because, you know, fans obviously were aware that the show was being made, but they hadn't seen anything yet because nothing had been released of what we had shot at this point. So it was interesting seeing fans' kind of interpretation of what they thought certain ships would look like, and then knowing what our drawings look like. And it was interesting how people were kind of like getting it, they were close, and like they had similar ideas of what the ships and some of the sets and characters look like, you know, even though they hadn't seen anything. So that is an interesting sort of connection, that it's like, wow, okay, the fans are kind of imagining this and we've already imagined it, and we're kind of all on the same page. So it's kind of a good feeling that you know that you're kind of subconsciously connected with the fans somehow, even though they haven't seen anything.
Yeah, I was just saying on the last episode of our podcast how in the books the Roci is described as looking vaguely like a coffee mug with a wedge on the front, and it totally does.
Right. Well, I mean, and all those things were taken into account, because obviously Ty and Daniel were involved with you know, they were looking at all these drawings too, and they were having input, and, you know, everyone had read the descriptions in the books. So I think that was the goal, was to try and be as faithful as whatever we could pick up from the books, because we knew that's what everyone's going to be comparing it to. Everyone's going to compare what they see to what they read. So it has to have some, you know, it has to have connection. It has to be faithful, you know, as much as possible. Because obviously there's not everything is described visually in the book. So some of those things are open to interpretation, but it still has to be in the same vein of, you know, what these guys had in their heads when they wrote the books.
Well, one thing that's really impressed me so far is the various ships that we've seen the interior of.
Right.
They all have very distinctive looks. So, you know, if you're on the Donager or the Roci or the Canterbury, they're all very different.
Right. And what's interesting about me, because we did, you know, the amazing thing, and hopefully you'll get a chance to talk to Seth, because he can do more justice to this than I can. But, you know, they had literally like an entire like wing of our offices was the art department, and you'd walk in there and literally like every wall in there, floor to ceiling, was covered with reference images from like NASA and like prototype ship designs of various space agencies, and, you know, scientific kind of theoretical designs. And, you know, they literally had pulled everything they could find on space travel and, you know, futuristic kind of hypothetical designs and textures. Like, they literally had like hundreds of images everywhere. And, you know, all these things were taken into account as they were designing these ships, because we knew that there was this, you know, these various timelines of some ships are relatively new. So they're, you know, the most current or the most futuristic in that time. So there's 250 years in the future, and some are 100 years older than that. So they're only maybe like 150 years in the future. So you've got this crazy time gap where it is all still in the future, but there's still a huge time gap of like really, really old technology in the future with really state-of-the-art technology, and making sure that the ships reflected that. So the Canterbury was sort of like our oldest, most kind of rundown, you know, it was a converted ship, and, you know, it kind of had that very old technology feel to it. And you've got the Donager, which is like super high tech and state-of-the-art. And, you know, so that was really kind of fun to work through that and to kind of get this real crash course and you know, lesson from, because the art department really had done their homework and they knew all of these things from a physics and science standpoint. So if you ever had questions about anything, I could just go in there and either look at the wall or talk to them, and they would have, you know, input on all this stuff. So I think I did a great job of incorporating those things into the ship, so you really could feel that the gaps in technology of the very latest state of the art to the you know, the most kind of ancient technology that still works in that, you know, in that time period.
Yeah, that's really cool. They're not all just the same.
No, they're not. They're not, and it's you know, they're not all slick and high tech, and you know, and that was something that we as the show went, it also kind of evolved. Like, we kind of, things got a little grittier and dirtier as we went. Like, you know, the more we went into the episodes, that everything kind of got a little bit darker and dirtier as we went, and that was sort of like a, you know, it was a designed idea that as we went, things would kind of get a little bit grittier and darker. And, by the end, they end up in places that are, Eros is much more gritty and darker and dirtier than Ceres is. And, and that was, we were trying to be very aware of that to make sure that there was a distinction that as you were moving along through the show, that you would feel that you're moving through these kind of different levels of technology, and things are getting older and dirtier and,
Yeah, totally. So what would you say was the most challenging part of the production process for you personally for The Expanse?
Probably, because I was the only director of photography, the way we would shoot is we would shoot 2 episodes at a time in a block. So we would have one director doing 2 episodes at a time.
Okay.
So there would be, I would basically work with that director for those 2 episodes. And then when the next block of episodes, the next 2 episodes were starting to shoot, we would actually overlap them by about 2 days or 3 days, roughly 2 to 3 days, where we called them double up days.
Okay.
So it was basically a way of using the studio space more efficiently.
Okay.
So my gaffer, who's my lighting chief lighting technician, would become the cinematographer of the double up day unit. So we essentially would have 2 main units shooting at the same time. So the challenge was always working with the second team. With now suddenly there's another team shooting and making sure that everything they're doing is tying in with what we're doing. And thankfully, Mike Galbraith, who was my gaffer, he knew the show intimately because he was with us every day on the main unit. So when he was able to step away to do the second unit sort of double up days, he knew what he was doing. So I had that buffer, but that took some of the challenge away. But the main challenge was really staying ahead of what was coming all the time, because we always had, in the beginning, I had 2 months to prep the first couple of episodes, which was really setting up the world of the core of the world was being set up in that first 2 months of prep. But once we started shooting, that went away. I no longer had that luxury, because now I'm shooting and I have to just keep shooting. So, there's always that next episode coming up. So you're basically trying to stay ahead of what's coming next, because it wasn't like we built all the sets and then now you just start shooting. We built some of the sets for the first 2 episodes, but everything after that, there's new sets came along. We had to keep planning for what was coming next, and they were constantly building new things. So it was always that challenge of staying ahead of what's the latest version of the script and how does that influence what the sets have to do, and making sure that I had enough time to talk with Seth, the production designer, to make sure that the sets were being built in a way that we could shoot in them, because we have to basically always incorporate our lighting into the sets, because the worlds are so 360 that you see the ceilings and the floors and the wall, you see everything. Yeah. At some point you can't have movie lights hanging in the scene like you could in a traditional film set, because we're often in these kind of completely immersive environments where the camera might look everywhere. So we have to kind of assume that the lighting could be seen, so that everything had to be built into the sets for the most part.
Oh, wow.
So, that was my challenge, was always staying ahead of what sets are they building that are going to show up in the next 2-3 weeks or a month away. When we're going to have to walk into that set and it has to be ready to shoot. And I so we'd have to always be in sync, myself and the set construction department and Seth's team, to make sure that we were all on the same page. So for me, it was basically, it meant going in on the weekends and because there wasn't really time during a shooting day to have any kind of serious discussion. So to have any kind of conceptual creative talk, I would go in on a Sunday when there was nobody around. It was just Seth and I, and we go to his office and we just sit and talk about the next, couple episodes and go through the scripts, and we both have ideas and we'd sketch things out. And, so it was that just kind of always staying ahead of what was coming. I mean, it was a lot of fun. It was never kind of a burden. It was just sort of like, okay, like what's next and what's the next challenge, and just constantly trying to stay ahead and keep the bar up of what we've established. You got to keep that bar high, that make sure that we're always doing justice to the world, and that everything stays at that level of, what we've already started out with. So, I mean, for me, that was probably the biggest challenge is just staying ahead of there was just so much construction. I mean, we had 3 stages in total. It's like 70,000 square feet. Wow. And there was always construction happening in one of those sets. In the beginning, we had 120 laborers building sets in 3 stages. So you'd walk between the stages and there's literally an army of carpenters and painters and just working for weeks and weeks at a time. So we had that constant challenge of just staying ahead of those guys, because they're a machine. Once they start, they're like an army, and you got to make sure they get the orders in time so that you don't show up and they're like, oh, why is this here? You have to make sure that they know what your expectations are, and they, as long as they had that, those guys were amazing. I mean, we had probably some of the best, film carpenters and set designers in the city. And that was really great as well. Like knowing that we had sort of like the best people you could possibly get to make this stuff. And they all had a great time because they loved building this stuff. They don't get to build these kinds of sets very often. So they had a ball, like, making all these great, unusual shapes and interesting lines and details and, curves and all kinds of things that it isn't that often that kind of stuff comes up. So they were kind of having a ball building those sets.
Well, I got to say, when they make the behind the scenes movie, I can't wait to see the fast speed playback of one of these sets being built.
There's a couple. They did some time lapse of some of the sets being built in the beginning, and it was, I would go down every few days because our offices were on the same lot as the stages, so we could walk down, a couple minutes walk, and you could go through the stages, and it was always cool to walk through and see the progress of, like, the day before to the next day. It's like, wow, like suddenly there's a ceiling on this set that didn't have one yesterday, or
wow.
They had to work fast, so that's why they had so many people to keep the speed up, because it's it's kind of like taking like a feature film and compressing it into a much shorter time period.
Yeah. So I'm curious, when you have a set that you use throughout the season, are you able to leave that up, or do you have to tear it down and put it back up again?
No, we could leave it up. So that we did have some sets that were sort of what we call standing sets.
Okay.
So, the Midtown stretch was one of those sets. Of course, the Medina tunnels, that was a massive set. It was like 160 feet long, and
wow,
they actually poured concrete, like the actual floor of that set. Seth wanted to make it look as much like real rock and the way it had been carved out of rock. So they actually poured like 3 or 4 inches of concrete, and then, kind of raked it and roughed it up so it looked kind of like gravel. So it was, imagine having to pour all that concrete. So those sets didn't move; they stayed, and the airlock set stayed. Miller's apartment was a standing set, and then other sets, they were smart about, like the Canterbury obviously only existed for the first episode, but then Seth was smart in the way he designed it, and that a lot of the things that we knew that we would only have for a short period were built to be modular. So you could take, the set was basically like almost like Lego pieces. Okay. So you could take those pieces, reconfigure them into a new shape, repaint them, redecorate them, relight them, and instantly you've now got a new space, without having to basically waste all that wood and material, which is a huge amount of cost and labor.
Yeah.
That you can kind of repurpose it in a way that you can't really tell it's the same place because you've completely reinvented it, but you're still using the same basic building blocks. So from a production standpoint, it's efficient because you're basically just moving pieces around, and and it works well with the whole theory of the science, in that things in that time period were 3D printed. So if you're building parts of a space station, you would literally 3D print them, and so that meant that everything had a kind of similar geometry and look to it because it was all made in the same process. So it kind of allowed us to have that. There's certain patterns that you'll see repeated because that's the way the world works, and it worked from a creative standpoint, and it worked from an efficiency standpoint because we could really kind of jig certain set pieces. Some we rebuilt from scratch, and some we were able to reuse certain pieces. And right now we have everything that we built from the first season is basically in storage right now, and that'll all get rebuilt and repurposed. And there'll be a lot of new sets, though. We have to start from scratch and build a lot of new things. But the Rosie, for example, that set was built in a way that we knew that this will be the ship that goes on for a long time. So it was built to be expandable. So there's many parts of the ship that we haven't seen yet. So we designed it so that there's areas where they can go downstairs or go into different areas where that will become a new set eventually. There'll be more to the ship that we'll keep building more and more of it as we go. So, so the Rosie is probably the one set that will be carried more than any other set in the show, because it's sort of like the mothership in that sense.
Yeah, very cool. I feel like the making of the show would be just as interesting as actually watching the show.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of elements going on, and
yeah.
and certainly having a tour of the art department was always fascinating because you could just see how much research had gone into what they were doing. And there was so much, you just had to look at the walls and see all the photos and things that they printed, like basically covering every wall in the office, and that they were drawing on that for, reference and inspiration. And, the set decorator and his team, they were basically constantly sourcing materials, and they'd always come in with like, hey, check out this thing. And they'd have all these amazing stacks of samples of all these, materials and fabrics. And it was always like going in and like almost like it was kind of like a candy store of textures and visual ideas. And you could basically pick things like, hey, this is a great texture. What if we put this with this? And what if we shine light through this thing? And what if we use this? And it was always kind of like this sort of like think tank of, creative. Whenever I walked into that office with some kind of problem to solve, I could sit down with one of those guys and we could go through a stack of all kinds of cool materials and be like, hey, this is this plastic thing and this fabric and this metal sheet, and you put those together. And so that was always fun of, kind of finding combinations of materials and textures that you could, come up with something new every time we had to create a new world.
Yeah. I know people are doing their research because I remember when I first saw the stealth ships,
right?
They really reminded me of one of our actual real world stealth fighters,
right?
The F-117.
Sure.
Yeah, it totally it seemed like it was an evolution of that technology, which I thought was really cool.
Well, and you've got, Bob Monroe, our visual effects supervisor, he knows his stuff from that standpoint. And you've got Narain, our showrunner, and, Narain has an engineering background. He's a PhD in engineering.
Oh, wow.
And, so he's working with Ty and Daniel, and those guys also have done their homework from a physics and science background. So you got all those guys working together, trying to visualize, okay, what does this stuff look like?
Yeah.
But from a physics and a science standpoint, and they're all coming at it from an actual, trained science background. So nothing is left to like, it wasn't about making it look pretty or sleek and aerodynamic, because
right.
we knew that those things didn't apply in this world. And from a real world standpoint, these ships aren't going to be sleek, pretty things. They're going to look like, oil rigs on their side, or like, they're going to be chunky and angular, and, and that's the most efficient way to make a ship to do what it has to do in the future. And then the fact that none of the ships have windows, that was another thing to wrap your head around, because, you right away you assume, well, there's going to be a window, there's going to be sunlight coming in, and there'll be sun lighting the main cockpit or whatever. But there are no windows, because, right away, like Ty and Daniel told us, like, windows are the most inefficient thing in a ship. And at that point in the future, they would never have windows because it's too inefficient, it's unsafe,
right.
It's risky, and you'll have cameras everywhere on the ship that will give you a view of anything you want to look at outside the ship. So it'll basically all be about monitors and virtual displays, So that was an interesting, that whole, kind of school of spaceship design and the physics of it were things I hadn't really thought of before until I started getting into this. And then it made perfect sense. Like once we started getting into it, it's like, yeah, of course, why would they have windows? And of course, the whole notion of the fact that, everything in the ship is actually kind of sideways, that when you see a ship flying, it's actually, everyone's actually kind of standing sideways, because that's how under thrust gravity pushes you against the floor.
Right.
And you would actually be standing sideways if you were to look at the ship from the outside,
Yeah.
Those are all things that I'd never seen in science fiction before.
Yeah. It's really cool stuff. And I love all the thought that goes into everything, like every little detail.
I mean, and for me, like, as we're grading, like when I do the final color correction, because I go in and do the final color correction of each episode. And like today, we just finished the last episode. So officially, we finished color correcting today, like the 10th episode. But it's usually the first time I get to see the finished final visual effect shots. And, which is the best thing, because up to that point, I've only seen very rough kind of black and white sort of like preview animation. So, I don't see the final thing until I go to the actual finish, color finishing session. And, it's great to see all that thought and detail, is suddenly been turned into this beautifully rendered, detailed, computer graphic image, which to me is like, about as real as you can possibly get when you're trying to imagine that world. And I think those guys did a great job.
Can you explain color correcting, what's involved with that and what that is?
Sure.
Exactly?
Well, I mean, for anyone who's familiar with Photoshop, it's kind of that idea, but in motion, right? So,
okay.
when we're shooting, part of the trick with the way we shoot is that and this is done in a lot of, cinema and TV shows nowadays. Now that we shoot digitally, right? Like we're not shooting on film anymore. We're shooting digital. Mm-hmm. And when we're shooting, you have the ability to kind of create like a simulated look. So imagine like the best, example I can think of is, say, like Instagram, where you have like all these filters that you can plug in and create like a look, like a washed out look, a contrasty look, a super colorful look, or whatever. We have the ability as we're shooting to make our own custom digital filters that we can apply to the feed coming from the camera. So when you look at the monitor on set, it has that preview of that look on the monitor. So if you were standing there looking at it with your naked eyes, it doesn't look quite the same because you're looking at it unaffected. So we're creating those looks as we shoot, so that it's important that everyone on set can look at that monitor and really imagine the final look of that world, because it requires sort of that magical transformation through this Photoshop process, if you want to call it that, to give it its kind of final grit and look. So we do that as we shoot, and those are kind of like temporary settings just for the editors to have that look while they're working on the edit. But then at the very end, when the show is finished being edited and it's all locked together and the sound mix is done and the visual effects are all complete, then there's one final kind of mastering process where you have to go in and you sit with a colorist who's basically like a virtuoso color master, and they're sitting in front of this very expensive console that is basically like Photoshop on steroids, where you can go through it, scene by scene, and set the look. And we're basically using the looks we created on as we were shooting as kind of like a guide. And then when we go into this final color correction session, we refine them even more, and we balance everything out shot to shot and scene to scene. And you're basically giving it that final visual polish. So, overall brightness, contrast, color, the hue, the tint, all those things you're able to kind of have absolute control over. So to me, that's the fun part, because that's where you get to see the final thing. And so I make sure that I'm there for all that, because I was there when we shot it. I know what the intent was of the initial shooting, and obviously I want to try and see it through to the very end and make sure that is done, because that's ultimately what the audience sees. What we produce there is what goes to the broadcasters. That's the Blu-ray, that's the iTunes, like all those things that come from that final. It's the same thing with music, where you'd go in and master an album and finish it. That's the same process, only now this is the visual equivalent of it. So really that's kind of what ultimately sets the overall tone of the look. So to me, it's an essential part. It'd be like not mixing a song if you were a pop star or something. It's like you have to have that final polish part, and and also it's making sure that the visual effects tie in to what we're shooting, because oftentimes we have set extensions where we've built part of the set and then the other half of it is Bob's world, and and they do an amazing job of tying them together. But in that color correction mastering stage, we have the ability to kind of do final tweaks to really make sure that there's no kind of like seam of the two, where the visual effect meets the real in camera shot. And so we have that kind of ability to just tweak subtle things to make sure that whatever is the set extension matches the in camera part. So I like that. That's for me the best part of the job is to get to go into that dark room and sit and do all that kind of magic stuff at the very end.
Wow, that sounds really cool. The more I learn about this world, the more I want to know.
Well, the great thing too with this technology now is, the executive producers and, the writers are in Los Angeles and I'm here in Toronto. So, we can do this stuff remotely now. So we can do, like today, for example, I'll spend the better part of a day working with Joanne, the colorist at Deluxe, and she's done the whole show with me. She's, excellent colorist, and she knows the show really well now. And we work together to set the look of the episode. And then the next day we have this like fiber optic link that connects Deluxe Toronto with one of their affiliate offices in Los Angeles. And those guys go to that room in LA and we're in the room in Toronto, and they're on speakerphone and we play the episode start to finish in Toronto, and they're basically watching it with us. And, they're looking at a calibrated monitor that's exactly the same as the one that we're looking at in Toronto. And so we know they're looking at exactly what we're looking at, but in virtually real time.
Wow.
And they can sort of say, hey, can we stop there for a second? Can we just kind of brighten that one little thing, or can we just tweak, so it's great having that immediate feedback, and it's like having them in the room with you.
Yeah.
And they do the same thing with the sound mix too. Like they can do the sound mixes that way. They do the full surround sound mix in Toronto, and those guys are sitting in a room in LA listening to the same sound mix there. So, I mean, this is the beauty of technology now, is you can work this way.
Yeah, that's super cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole thing. I came from a film background, so we used to shoot on film, and it was 35 millimeter film or 16 millimeter film, and that was the ultimate standard. And in the last 5 years, I haven't shot film because it's kind of slowly died out. But digital has now come into its own, and actually, I think that for the way we're using it and the way that we work with digital, it's you have far more freedom now, and far more creative freedom to do more bold things and try new things that you wouldn't have been able to take that risk if you're shooting on film.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. So what's your favorite part of what you do?
Well, I mean, ultimately what I do, my main, I guess, thing is lighting, right? So for me, it's really it's that process of trying to understand the world in terms of how is it lit? Where does the light come from? What quality is the light? And not just that, but what is the actual mood of that particular world? What is the intent of the scene, and how does light help tell that story? Because ultimately light is what's shaping and painting that world. So for me, it's the pre-design process of the script, getting to know the story, falling in love with scenes and with sets, and then trying to get that initial visual idea into the world of the production design team, building the set, and then actually putting the lights in there and watching the set come to life. Because when you see the set with the lights off, it doesn't look like anything really. It's the sets are basically dead until they're lit, and
wow,
everybody kind of knows that. It's like, as we're building them, it's always kind of like, well, it kind of looks a bit weird. And it's like, well, once it's lit, everyone knows that once those lights go on, the set suddenly it comes up to life once those lights come on. So for me, it's that process of the whole kind of conception and working with the whole team of like, what's it supposed to look like? What's the idea? And then seeing it slowly come to life as the lights get installed, and seeing the lights coming on and balancing the levels and seeing the shadows and the textures start to come to life. And then suddenly, okay, now we're in a world. Now this is a place when you see all those things come together. And to me, that's the best part. Like, is that it's almost like you've breathed life into this place through light. I mean, that's really what my job is to give it life through the light that hits the sets and the actors, So, yeah, I mean, that's why I do what I do. It's really the part that I love the most.
That's amazing. It's really cool.
It's kind of like sculpting in a way, or painting, or it's all those kinds of disciplines. Now you're applying it to a 3-dimensional space with, and with actors, and, trying to also make sure that the actors need to look the way they need to look and make them look good. And, all those things, it's, and the cast has been great in that way too. I mean, even Thomas Jane, a couple of times, he really wanted it to be dark. He was like, it's gotta be dark. And he would look at the monitor with us, and, he was always pushing me like, hey, God, it's gotta be dark. And, and he told me a couple of times, like, at the end of like an episode, as he was leaving, he's like, make sure it's dark. Make sure this is dark. Make sure you look, it's going to look dark, Jeremy. And I'm like, don't worry, Tom, it's going to be dark. And, so that was, having the cast kind of giving you those little, like, pep talks of like, don't be afraid of making it dark, make it dark. Because, he wanted it to have that noir look. And, I think he kind of identified with that in his character to a certain extent. So for him, it was important that he liked coming to look at the monitor, and so did a lot of the other cast, because they wanted to see, looking at it on the monitor, it's the world has been transformed through our kind of, special sauce, if you want to call it that. So they, everyone liked to come and look and get, okay, that's cool. Like, I like, it helped put them in the headspace of this is the tone of where we're existing as characters. Right. And, and I would also try and make sure, like, with my data guy, because I have my data manager right next to me all the time, and he's basically taking all the data from the cameras and putting it into a computer and backing it up and making multiple copies for all the different post departments. And he would basically work with me to take like frame grabs of everything we'd shoot that day. So at the end of the day, you'd have a couple dozen frame grabs, and I would put those on an iPad that I would bring to set the next day, and I would show the cast sort of like frame grabs of what we did the day before, so they could see like basically like a full resolution image of like the world in its full look. And it allowed them to kind of be like, oh, cool. Like that's, and we'd share those images amongst, the inner circle of the team, and everyone could kind of be like, okay, that's the look. And it allowed everyone to kind of really put themselves in that place. And I did that through the whole season, is making sure that everyone got to see the photos as we were grabbing the images from the camera, and that's another great thing about digital, is you couldn't do that with film. Here we are, like the next day, you shoot something the next day, here's a picture of it immediately. You're not waiting for a lab to process the film or, so.
That's got to keep everybody's excitement level high too, to be able to see
it does.
that.
It really does. I mean, it's kind of like, it's almost like you're a character in a graphic novel and you get to see the drawing of that world like the next day. And it really puts them in that mindset of like, okay, this is the world and this is how everyone looks. And this is how my character comes off on camera. And, it's funny because the cast would then start to come to us and say, hey, can we check out your iPad? We want to see what we did. Like, so you'd end up with these little huddles of the cast going through the iPad, looking at what the worlds look like. And sometimes because they don't necessarily get to see other scenes that they're not in, or, different worlds. So that for them, it would be a great way of seeing, oh, that's what Avasarala's world looks like, or this is what, Aaron Wright looks, because they wouldn't necessarily be in those scenes. Right.
Yeah.
And same with Tom, because Tom didn't get to see the spaceships that the Canterbury crew was in for a few episodes. So he had no idea what their world looked like, so it was great kind of keeping that from him. And then suddenly he's in that world and he's like, oh, I wish I was on a spaceship all the time.
Yeah. Well, maybe in the future he'll get to be on a spaceship.
Maybe in the future, yes.
No spoilers, though.
No spoilers. You can edit that part out.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I really appreciate it. This has been fascinating.
Oh, you're welcome.
I could pick your brain all day long.
Well, if people got questions, they can always ask us. But we'll be around to do more, and there'll be more questions, I'm sure, at some point.
Yeah, I'm sure. Awesome. Well, yeah, it's been a real pleasure. I've learned a lot.
Well, thanks for having me, and hopefully, it seems like the fans like what we're doing, and that's all we really could ask for, is that we're doing the things that they envision.
Yeah, I feel like the show hasn't quite hit critical mass where like everybody knows about it yet, and
no,
I'm not sure what the holdup is, but I think when it does, it's just gonna blow up.
I mean, these things take time, so I mean, we're not even halfway through the first season yet, really.
Right. I think these days there might actually be people that wait until the whole season's out so they can binge watch it.
Yeah, I would. I mean, if I was in that position, I would do the same thing. I'd probably want to just binge watch it. I wouldn't want to have to wait, a week at a time to watch it.
Yeah, it's a great show. I'm loving it.
Well, I'm glad you guys are, putting the word out.
Yeah, we try to do our small part.
Well, it all counts. I mean, it's all in this day and age. It's all about that, that's social media presence, and that that podcast spirit. It's a big part of what makes things successful. Yeah,
it's always good to have people excited about what you're doing.
Sure.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to hearing the next few podcasts.
Yeah. Was there anything you wanted to add, or did we cover it pretty well?
I mean, the only thing I didn't talk about is the LED thing. I don't know if that's something that people are interested in.
I am.
Okay.
I think people probably are.
Sure.
We got a lot of nerds watching this show.
Sure. All right. Well, I mean, I guess one of the things that we got into as we started designing the show is that we knew that we're trying to make these spaces as, in film world, when we talk about lights that exist in a set, we call them practical lights. So, if you're in a house, like a table lamp or a track lighting or whatever is actually there that actually throws light on the set, we call them practical lights. So in our world, in the Expanse world, we knew that a lot of these ships, and of course the first major challenge we had to create was the Canterbury, a lot of it would need to be practically lit, because the camera's going to be able to see every corner. Like you've got cramped spaces. It's kind of like being in a submarine where you've got, you can see everything. So the lights that are there to sort of, function as utilitarian lights also have to light the set and the cast at the same time.
Okay.
So the challenge was that, okay, well, how do we do this in a way that, we can put light in every little nook and cranny of the set and fit it into small spaces, and we need to have full control over it remotely. It has to be able to change color and dim and pulsate and all these things.
Okay.
And, in this day and age, LED lighting is that thing. And we've, LED lighting has really come into its own in the last couple of years. And even in the film business, in the last 5 or 6 years, the evolution of LED has really evolved. And it's now at a level that's so advanced more so than it's ever been. So we knew that the ultimate way to light all these environments was with LED as much as possible. So there's a company in LA called Lightgear that makes sort of professional grade LED lighting products that are of all different shapes and sizes. But the big one being what they call ribbon, which is basically like an inch or so wide, and it's flexible. It comes on a big spool, like almost like movie film, and it's got an LED pixel in it every couple inches or every inch or less, depending on the pitch that you order. And you can order it in red, green, blue. You can order it in full white or warm white. So we ended up ordering like thousands of feet of this stuff. I think we ended up ordering like $250,000 worth of this stuff.
Wow.
Because we knew once we started doing the math of how many sets would need it and all the, valances in the ceiling and everywhere that needed to go, it was a large amount of it. And it's the kind of thing that when you buy it, you're cutting it up, you're soldering it.
Okay.
You can't return it. It's a consumable item. So
yeah,
the only way to really use it is you have to buy it, So the producers understood that, and we made the case for it, and they understood the practicality of how these sets needed to work and how they had to look and feel and be lit. And then we all knew that LED was the way to go. So we ended up buying all this stuff and basically installing it into all the sets. And Mike Galbraith, my gaffer, and his team, they'd worked on a lot of big Hollywood films that in the last year or two that have used LED hugely. So his guys knew it really well, and they fabricated all these like long metal strips that were like maybe like an inch wide and like very thin aluminum, and they basically would stick 4 foot and 8 foot sections of this ribbon onto these strips of metal, which now became these modular. You could stick it anywhere. This little thin strip of light that you could stick anywhere, and you connect it all to like a central dimmer console, and you've basically got this giant, almost like a like a stage lighting console.
Yeah,
where every strip of that material on the set is completely independently controllable. So we could, you want to darken that one little area, we just, the guy on the dimmer board just brings down that little area, so it was, you basically had control over everything that way. And there's no heat, the sets don't get hot.
Oh, nice.
It dims easily. It can change color if you have the red, green, blue type. So you can have it go from white to blue to, so for some of our sets where battle mode lighting happens, or there's an emergency mode and things start to change color, we could do that with this LED lighting very easily, where in the past you'd end up using, filters that you'd have to install in the lights and change them. And it's time consuming and tedious, and it doesn't even look as good,
right.
So, that was a huge, for me, I'd never used LED to that extent. Like we used it everywhere. And, we even there's a lot of LED products that are meant for more like stage, like rock and roll and theatrical purposes that are not really used in film that much. But I went to one of the main suppliers of these things here in Toronto, and I had them show me like every LED thing that they had that was, normally get used in like rock and roll shows. And there's some amazing stuff in that world that in film, we never use that stuff because it's just not used in film. But for our show, for Expanse, it was the perfect kind of technology. So we tested all of it on camera, made sure that none of it flickered. And we just picked all our favorite, fixtures that they had, and we ended up with dozens and dozens of those things, and we put them all throughout the sets. And the great thing is a lot of them look, they look like something you'd see in a spaceship. So if you see the light itself, it's like, well, that doesn't look out of place, and it's actually lighting the set, and it's working for us from a film standpoint, but it's also part of the set design, so that was a great way of kind of that combination of, we need light on the set. It has to look good. It has to be functional. It has to fit in the set. And if you see it, it has to look like it belongs there. So all those things, LED did that for all those factors. It hit all those points for us. And, we would even make some of our own fixtures where, we needed lights that we could stick anywhere, that if we see them in the shot, it has to look like it's part of the set, so we custom made a lot of funky little boxes and fixtures that had LED in them that we could literally stick anywhere, that if you needed something quick, there's a light. And they became so much part of the set that those lights are, as much a part of the world as the set design is.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of LEDs.
I mean, it's the way to go. I mean, it's, for your home, there's no heat, from our perspective on set, like we're powering massive sets with like such little power. Like we've never used this little power. Yeah. Usually it's like thousands and thousands of watts. Yeah. And now we're using like a fraction of that, so from an environmental standpoint, it's even better.
Yeah. Very cool. I want LEDs in my house someday.
Well, you know what? I mean, Home Depot and all these places sell great LED, like retrofit bulbs you can screw into your existing fixtures. And the quality of the light now they used to be not so great. They were always kind of too cold or greenish but now the color, I would say, it's pretty much, what incandescent bulbs were. It's on that level now. So
now they've got the programmable lights.
There's a program you can get the iPhone app that you can control your color of your lighting in your home. In fact, like since the Expanse, I've actually changed some of the lighting where we live, like from things that I learned and was inspired by from the show. We made some of our own light fixtures here at home. They were direct kind of inspirations from the set.
Oh, nice.
So it was like, lights that can change color and
yeah.
So I'm basically living the world of the Expanse at home now. I brought it home with me.
That's so cool. Well, maybe in a decade or two, some of those fixtures will be on auction somewhere or something.
Yeah, they could be. I mean, or they could, we could put the plans online and people can make their own kits. Here's how to make your own Expanse light.
Oh, that would be cool.
Because they're all things you can pretty much, if you had the right tools and the stuff, you can buy all that stuff on the internet and you can make your own version of it, really.
I would be all over that. That'd be my new hobby.
You know what? To me, like I love anything to do with making lights. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. My wife might be on board. We have lots of fun. She's been photographing. That's not a word, I don't think. She's been taking pictures of her artwork.
Right.
And we had a lot of fun trying to get enough light for her to get good pictures. So,
well, now, I mean, the LEDs are so bright now that you can, put a handful of them together and create a pretty good wallop of light, and with very little, you can plug it into the wall and not blow a circuit. That's the amazing thing.
Yeah. Awesome. Very cool.
Oh, this is fun.
Yeah. Well, awesome, Jeremy. Yeah, this has been a blast.
Well, I hope people get a kick out of it.
Oh, I'm sure. I love this behind the scenes stuff because there's just so much that goes into this that, everyday people like me, we just don't know about, Thank you so much for your time, sir. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome, Lex. Well, good luck with the edit, and I look forward to hearing it.
Well, that's about going to wrap it up for episode 14 of Expanse, the unofficial podcast. I want to thank Jeremy once again for the fantastic interview. I'm sure you enjoyed it as much as I did, dear listener. Very awesome that he took his time to talk with us today. Really interesting stuff. It's so fascinating. I just can't learn enough. If you would like to reach the show, you can email us at expansepodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter @LexStarWalker. You can follow me on Google Plus LexStarWalker. Also, please check out our Google Plus community for the podcast. And Nikki and I post everything Expanse related that we can find there. So definitely check that out. Just the other night, I posted an image that Bob Monroe, who was on a previous episode, shared online showing some concept drawings of some of the various ships in the Expanse drawn to scale all the way down from a tiny, tiny little human all the way up to the Nauvoo. So very cool. Definitely go check that out. And it's really cool to see how massive some of these ships truly are. Also, please visit our website at starwalkerstudios.com. There you can find the show notes for this and all of the episodes. You can also find our other podcasts there. And in the show notes at the very top will be a nice red button that will take you to the Google Plus community for the show if you would like to join that and keep up to date on everything we can find, at least Expanse related. And really quickly, I want to give a shout out and a huge thank you to our Tier 5 patron, Mr. Steve Strickland. Let's hear it for Steve. Yeah. Woo! Go, Steve. You the man. So we here at Starwalker Studios appreciate all of our patrons and the support of all our listeners. Couldn't do it without you. And if you enjoy the show and you'd like to support the studio and help us keep bringing you great content, then you can learn more about becoming a patron yourself at starwalkerstudios.com. So until next week, I hope that you conserve your oxygen and your water. Resources are precious in the outer solar system.
So long, and thanks for all the fish.
Flip and burn, baby. Flip and burn.